Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Hello, and welcome to the next edition of the Power Trends podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Leninghan of the New York Independent System Operator. And for this episode, we're joined by Shaun Johnson, also of the NYISO, to help us understand a couple of important things. First, we're going to cover how the capacity market works, how it helps maintain reliability through the grid and transition, why during events like we just experienced with a recent early summer heat wave, we depend on the capacity market to help get us through. And then two, we're going to cover something called the demand curve reset, what that is, and again, why it's important to electric system reliability. Shaun, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Kevin. Glad to be here.
This podcast, like all the others, part of our effort here at the NYISO to explain how this complex electric system works, discuss the most important current issues related to the grid and transition. And Shaun, we had you here last when you were in your prior position as Director of Market Monitoring and Analysis. And we talked about how that group helps keep markets fair and competitive. You've moved into a different role now, Director of Market Design. So first, congratulations on the move.
Thank you.
Not such a huge departure from where you were previously, but certainly additional challenges. Bigger group in market design on balance, yes?
Yeah, generally we have a few more things to look at and to look out in the future for as opposed to observing behavior on a day-to-day basis.
That's a good segue into the discussion for today. So, Shaun, when we talk to groups and we try and explain the main responsibility of NYISO, we cover four things, right? We say we operate the high voltage electric system that's focused on reliability of the grid, and then there's system and resource planning, so identifying the future needs of the electric system, which ties back to operations. What do we need to do to invest in the system today to ensure reliability in the future? Then we also talk about overseeing and operating the competitive electric markets. And that's where we want to focus today, simplify for folks that maybe are new to understanding the markets. We have two main markets, energy and capacity. So in the simplest terms, let's try and explain the difference and the core functions of both. Shaun, does it make sense if we think about the energy market as the electrons themselves, the commodity, and then the capacity market is the promise to deliver those electrons whenever the consumers demand the energy?
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy for both of those markets, right? The energy market is there for whenever you turn on your lights or turn on your air conditioning, we need to make sure that we have power flow coming to your house to do that. The capacity market is how we make sure that we, as the grid operator, are able to meet those needs that are coming in the future, right? If you think about how much energy you use overnight, you're asleep, your lights are off, you probably turned your air conditioner down, so your draw on the system is really low. But we know when you get up in the morning, you're going to turn your lights on, you're going to turn your coffee maker on, you're going to start cooking, the demands for energy are going to increase. And so we have to be ready for that increase. And if it's really cold or really hot, those demands get much, much larger. So we need to make sure that we are positioned to meet that need that's coming.
And when we think about market design, the New York markets are a little different than other competitive electric markets around the country, right? Not every, what we call control area, has a capacity market. What's the difference there? And maybe why have some states and regions decided not to have a capacity market? Is there a way for folks to understand that?
I think the best analogy is you can think of a capacity market like insurance. So when you purchase insurance, whether it be car insurance or life insurance or medical insurance, what you're really trying to do is smooth out your costs over time. You're going to pay a little bit every month so that when something occurs, you don't have to pay it all at once. And so it's sort of your protection against that big unknown price hit that might happen, but also allows you to budget that and pay it over time. That's very much what a capacity market is for the energy world, is that we know at certain points we're going to need a whole lot of power. You don't always know exactly when, but we know we need to be ready for that. So we have created a market to be able to pay resources some money over time so that they are always ready and available to be there for us so that they are able to maintain their costs and be available. Another alternative is if you forego insurance and you're willing to just pay as you go. That's a better analogy of, say, an energy only market, which is, all right, every once in a while, I'm going to have a huge need. And, a great example of this is in Texas. They don't have a capacity market. They are an energy only market. And when they have huge demands on their electric grid and are at their sort of reliability peaks to meet their energy needs, their prices get very high in the energy market, because that is the avenue for those resources to recover their costs. And maybe that's the only day they run the entire year. So they have to recover their entire years of revenue for operation in that one instant in time. And so it's really just a different way of looking at how to recover costs in the market, how you are willing to pay for it as an entity. Is it going to be an insurance product where you're paying installments over time, or is it going to be a pay-as-you-go model where you're going to pay a lot at once?
So not to pick on Texas too much here, but the other element I think worth highlighting here is that they've experienced some extreme heat over the last several seasons. And it's in those times when there's such great demand on the system that maybe they weren't anticipating. They've had to issue some consumer appeals because the system's getting stressed. They may not have all of the commodity at a certain number of hours that the consumers are demanding. And so they're telling those consumers, can people elect, please, to not use appliances, for instance? How does the capacity market ensure we have enough of those electrons, even if it's for one day out of the entire year?
One of the benefits that we see in the capacity market is that we can say, all right, this is what we predict the amount of energy we're going to need in the future and how much we're going to need during our peak periods. But we also acknowledge that, first of all, our ability to forecast isn't perfect. No one's a perfect forecaster, right? And that random events could happen. Maybe something else trips offline. Maybe our neighbors can't supply us with energy. Maybe units don't start. And so we're able to build a reserve on top of that. So an additional amount that we are going to procure beyond what we are forecasting to need. And then that gets built into our price model so that we can then go out and make sure that not only do we have enough to cover our needs, but also a safety blanket in case there's some unexpected events. Compared again to, say, that pay-as-you-go energy-only model, the hope there is that resources will forecast it themselves and be around and available and be paid and compensated. But it's a gamble and it's a risk. Sometimes you have the resources, sometimes you don't. So one of the benefits of this insurance type capacity market is that you're able to go procure your needs and build in some reserves as well.
One more detail inside of the capacity market before we get to the demand curve reset that's important to understand. So we have, as you mentioned, this reserve margin. There's been some changes in how we calculate that reserve margin, right? That security blanket that you talk about, that insurance product, if you will, that you're talking about, because the grid is in transition. So we're losing generation. We also are taking on additional new assets that are intermittent. How does that impact that reserve margin and how we calculate?
So one of the things we've always counted for in New York is this idea that our generation fleet, so the producer of energy, are going to be relatively stable. Yes, they may have an occasional outage, something may go wrong, but if they're online, they had enough fossil fuel to be able to produce for a lengthy period of time. And that was sort of embedded in all of our decision making and all of our models here at the NYISO. As we begin to transition to a new world, particularly when you look at things like intermittence, the wind doesn't always blow. Obviously, the sun doesn't always shine. We've had to incorporate that variability now into the amount of reserves we procure. Another thing that we've had to factor in and account for is something new like a dynamic load. When you think about something like a data center or crypto mining, these are huge energy consuming businesses that are price responsive and can not consume energy when prices get high. So there is some give and take there as well, some variability that we've never had to really account for before. And so we've built some really advanced forecasting setups to be able to look at all these different variables moving in context with each other. And that has required the amount of reserve that we procure to go up, because as you get more variability, there's less things you can count on. You need to make sure that your reserve margin or your safety blanket is bigger to cover all these different scenarios. And so every year, our reserve margin in the last few years has gone up slightly to cover for this new accountability. And we expect will continue to do so as this grid continues to transition from an old fossil fleet to all of these new technologies, which tend to be more intermittent in nature.
Okay, another really good segue. I think it's important just quickly for folks to understand, we don't set that reserve margin unilaterally, correct? This is set with lots of different data points and metrics, and the reserve margin is set with the input and approval of many different entities, stakeholders, as well as state entities, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So the NYISO does not set the reserve margin, right? This is one of the areas where we act as an authoritative source of information. The process starts really with the New York State Reliability Council, and we run cases, we provide them data, provide them information, work with them and collaborate so they make sure they have the information that they need and they are informed of, and then they will begin and set the reserve margin. And then that margin then is ultimately approved both by our Federal Regulatory Commission and the Public Service Commission here in New York.
All right, excellent. So let's help folks to understand the demand curve reset, which impacts the prices that are set within the capacity market. What's the simplest way to understand the demand curve reset for someone that is not following the process and maybe doesn't understand the complexities of what goes into establishing the capacity market itself?
The example I love to give to people is it's like buying a home. And so you first have to figure out, what type of home do you want? Do you want a small colonial? Do you want a condo in Manhattan? So first you need to figure out the type of home you need. And our tariff set that up as a peaking unit that's got a high cost of producing energy but a low cost of install. And then how are you going to pay for that? What do you want that house to have? What kind of kitchen are you going to have? And then how are you going to finance it? Are you going to get a mortgage? Is it going to be a 30-year mortgage, a 15-year mortgage? And what sort of interest rate are you willing to pay for? And so all of these factors that you need to think about when you're purchasing a home are the same things that we need to think about when we're building a new generator. What do we need? What attributes does it need to have? And how are we going to pay for it? And so it's a long process that we look at all of these elements and try and come up with the perfect answer for each location.
And I want to cover some of those elements because I think it's important for folks to know what those are and the ingredients, but go back to an important point that you made a moment ago. So to connect the dots a bit, we have these stringent reliability requirements. Those help us determine how much energy producing capability we're going to need to meet those requirements, how to reduce the potential for outages. And then the capacity market is more or less getting commitments from these suppliers to help us meet those reliability requirements, reduce the chances of the outages, even if they're not running frequently. We know they're there, even if it's for 8 hours on the hottest day of the year, because consumers are demanding that electricity. There's a way for people to understand the demand curve as a way to ensure that that unit, that power supplier, gets the revenue it needs to still stay in New York in that place for those 8 hours?
That's right. The result of generators receiving that capacity revenue, they receive an obligation. And their obligation is every single day that they are a capacity supplier in New York, so that we have paid them for. They have an obligation to offer into our market for the period of time they're available, or to tell us why they're unavailable, right? Obviously, these things need to be repaired. They're machines. Yeah. Just like your car needs an oil change or your tires rotated, sometimes the generators need to do work on their machines to keep them up and running. But those are their requirements, is they have to offer into our markets and be available to us. And like I said before, we may go 360 days a year and not select them to run in the energy market. But those handful of days that we do select them, those are the days that we need them the most, right? And so their obligation is they have to offer.
So a lot goes into calculating what it takes in order to incentivize those units to be there for those tight times. We don't want to just throw money at those units indiscriminately. We want to make sure that we calculate what's fair, what the market would demand for that particular generating asset to stay there. As you're talking about, there's lots of factors that go into making sure a machine like this can stay ready for those 5 days a year when demand is highest. What goes into that, Shaun? There's lots of things like variable costs and fixed costs, and it's a complex, complicated set of inputs. Can you help us understand that?
The first thing we do is we focus on some technologies that we think meet our needs. And by that, I mean, are they proven technologies, right? So we're not going to base this off of something that's never been built and never been run, and we don't actually know if it will.
The technology we want to incentivize is out there, and there's proof it works, it's running, and we have some data.
Right. So that narrows our list down, right? Then we look to see, okay, can these things be sited in locations that where we need them in New York? Are they able to be built here? If they are, do they begin to meet our needs, what we call a peaking plant, right? These are high cost to produce energy and relatively low costs of installation. So I'll pick on something like nuclear, which is maybe the exact opposite. It costs a lot of money to build a nuclear plant. But once it's built, it costs not a whole lot of money for it to produce energy. So that's the exact opposite of the type of resource we're talking about. We're talking about something that these tend to be smaller units, a little more flexible, easier to and cheaper to install. That now has narrowed our focus down to a real handful of units to look at. And we need to figure out what their costs are, how much it would cost to buy or lease the land that they need to be purchased on, how much it costs to hook them up to the grid, right? It's not like you can go to Walmart and get an extension cord and run a generator into the electric grid. There's a lot of engineering that needs to go on and transmission lines that need to be built. And there's a cost with that. So we have to calculate what that is. We have to figure out what it costs them to run on a day-to-day basis when they do run. What type of fuel are they going to run on? Are there controls that need to be put in place to control emissions? How does that work? What are those rules? What are the costs associated with that? That's all factored in. Are there local zoning laws that they need to configure to meet? Are there reliability or computer or security standards that they need to meet? What are the costs for those? So that all factors into the various costs. And then ultimately, how do we pay for it? That's a big cost for anything you purchase. Nobody wants to go and pay full cash for everything most of the time, particularly investors. And so they're going to pay some cash up front. Then they're going to finance it, right? So they have to borrow, they have to incur debt. How much does it cost them to incur this debt? Just like your mortgage, is it going to be 15 years or 20 years or something else? And so that all factors into these calculations.
Okay, so it's probably important also to highlight that we are under a regulatory imperative, generally speaking, as the market administrator, to achieve the lowest costs available. So we're using all of these inputs and trying to do this calculus to discover what is, as the tariff you keep talking about says, is just and reasonable. Correct?
That's correct. Just like everything we do here at the NYISO, we're trying to meet reliability for consumers at the lowest possible cost. Our job is to make sure we look at all of these factors to meet all of the rules and regulations that are prescribed for this proxy generator, and then to make sure it meets our reliability needs and is the lowest cost solution.
So as you're describing this process, this demand curve reset, we're trying to estimate the cost and the viability of building new generation technologies in New York. And we have to look at these factors and these inputs that go into that calculus because they change. And we do this every 4 years. A lot of things have changed in 4 years about the economy, about technology, and the public policies. So can you walk us through what some of the discovery has shown?
Yeah. So we'll talk about two things in particular, right? One is with the adoption of the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act here in New York. The laws are pretty clear on when fossil fuels will really no longer be able to operate in New York, and that's 2040. So if you're looking to build a new fossil fuel generator in New York, you know that it has an end of life out in 2040. And so now we'll take it back to that conversation I was mentioning earlier is I know I need to recover all of my money by 2040. So I can't finance this for 20 or 30 years because the last several years it won't be in operation. There's no revenue to recover. And so now the recovery period is much shorter, which means from a cost perspective, the profile has gone up. That also is at a time where, just like everything else in our lives, right? If you had told me 20 years ago that a Big Mac was going to be $10 or $12 or whatever it is now at McDonald's, my mind would have been blown. But that's where we are in today's economy and with the inflation we have seen recently. Similar for the cost of construction of these units, particularly these fossil units, they've gone up substantially since we looked at them 4 years ago, and they are much more expensive to construct than they used to be. The other thing that is interesting that we've seen in this evaluation is that storage devices are now starting to become mainstream and starting to enter the world of energy reliability. Places like California, Texas, and even the southeastern United States have had huge injections of storage in the last few years. That's done two things. One, it's proven the technology works and can be used to manage the grid. The other it has done is it's reduced the cost of construction of these resources, right? As you begin to build out the infrastructure to build them, the parts become more available, they become cheaper. And so these devices now are starting to look very attractive and economic, where 4 years ago, they didn't remotely compete with a fossil unit. Now, in some cases, they actually look far more economic than fossil resources. And so this is a new technology that's really entered the discussion in this demand curve as, is this going to be the selection of choice for these storage devices?
It's hard to overstate how big a change that is, especially from the last time we went through this. Going back to what you highlighted a moment ago, the cost of building anything in the last 4 years have gone up. Inflation has been a headline for the last couple of years coming out of the pandemic. And as we record this at the end of June, there's lots of current discussion about whether the Fed is actually going to cut rates before the end of the year now, because inflation looks even more sticky. All of that aside, there's going to be an increased cost to build anything in New York. And so we're seeing some cost increases when we look at any of these technologies. Let's talk about some of the differences between those estimated cost increases between the technologies, just so people get an idea.
We're still trying to nail down the exact numbers, but I'll use rough estimates here. The current proxy unit in New York is what we say is a quick start unit. You can almost think of like a jet engine. And it's able to turn on quickly and meet our reliability needs. And that's what sets the price today. So our demand curve reset process is looking out for the next 4 years. That same unit that we use today, those costs have almost doubled. In some places, more than doubled compared to 4 years ago.
When you look at that, what stands out?
Just like the main drivers have been in all of our household costs, right, is the underlying cost of construction has risen significantly. Materials have gone up in price significantly. Cost of building a turbine has gone up. Parts are not in great supply. That has also driven up costs. And then the other thing that has gone up is the cost of capital. 10 years ago, you could get a mortgage. I refinanced my house during COVID because the rates was almost zero. It was like free money. Now mortgage rates are 7 or 8%. The cost of financing these generators is similar. A few years ago, they were roughly half of what they're going to be over the next 4 years. And so you can think about what that means in terms of a car payment or a mortgage payment going from a really low rate to a rate of 7 or 8%. That has a huge impact. And it's not just the cost of materials and land and construction of these resources. It's also how do we pay for them? The financing has gone up drastically as well.
So if the costs of building the fossil-based newest available technology, newest available and viable technology on the market today, if those costs have doubled, why are we seeing lower costs to build a battery through some of the analysis?
One of the main drivers in the lower cost to build a battery is the infrastructure. So the cost per unit has gone down a lot in the last 4 years. So 4 years ago was the first time we had really looked at energy storage as a potential option in the demand curve reset, and the costs were very high. Part of that is there was actually very little energy storage out on a wholesale grid level that was used to meet the reliability needs of the electricity grid. that has changed. Thousands of megawatts of storage has been deployed, not only throughout the United States, but throughout the world. And as the infrastructure, so as the assembly lines have been built and those units are being mass produced, the cost to produce each unit has gone down drastically. And that has led to a similar decrease in the cost of constructing those resources. Now, their costs for financing have gone up, just like a fossil unit has, but the cost of constructing them has gone down so much that their cost profile has flipped, where they went from being a very expensive unit that looked uneconomic to something that looks very economic now in comparison.
I should be careful about how we set up that question here. So on a relative basis, the costs have come down since 4 years and definitely are lower than building the gas-fired turbine, but it's still expensive to do anything in this economy. And so we are seeing some projected cost increases if the proxy unit is a battery. Should probably clarify that.
Yeah, that's correct. The storage costs, and one of the questions with storage that we're trying to figure out right now is how long that device needs to run. But regardless of which attribute we select, the prices go up depending on the attributes we need to meet reliability. And it will be an increase for the next 4-year cycle. Just the question of how big of an increase are we looking at?
Okay, so that's another good segue into, I think, another important question, which is you and I have been talking about and focused on building a new unit, new technologies, incentivizing that kind of investment through the markets to serve the reliability needs. Let's just address this up front. There are some people who question the value of the capacity market. And in this sense, with regard to the demand curve reset, they're going to say, we shouldn't pay more. And why would a unit that exists today and is older, maybe doesn't meet the environmental attributes that we want in the CLCPA, get paid more through your capacity market, even though things haven't changed for that particular asset? Why does that make sense? Right? I think we should probably just try to address that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and certainly something that probably deserves a much longer discussion. But at a high level, their costs have also changed, right? So just like all of us, we're not new units, we're not constructing, but so we'll use the home analogy again. Costs for new homes have skyrocketed, right? Materials have gone up, construction costs have gone up, but costs for existing homes have also gone up. Replacement part costs for these generators have gone up. Their labor costs have gone up dramatically, right? So their costs have also gone up a lot in the last 4 years. And so remember, part of that reason we have the capacity market is to not only attract new resources when we need them, but also to make sure that the existing resources who are here to keep our lights on, that their costs are covered so that they stay around and continue to provide us energy when we need it. And so the capacity market proxy unit is intended to do both. And that's the purpose of our demand curve, is not only to incent this new build out, but also until we transition to a fully emissions-free grid that's envisioned for 2040 with the CLCPA, we need to keep our current, or at least some of our current fleet around through that transition. And how do we facilitate that? One of the mechanisms is using our current existing capacity market to make sure that they are revenue adequate to cover their costs so that they don't go out of business and close their generators down.
So you used an important phrase there, through the transition. So we're not counting on all of these older units being around forever. There's environmental regulations, and then we have the statute itself, the CLCPA, that seeks to exit all of those resources. Do you see through this transition the capacity market as a way to bridge us, in a sense, through some of the ups and downs between increasing demand and shift in supply?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of our primary tools. I say one of, right? Our markets are set up so that we have a variety of different tools to tackle this problem. The energy market is another great tool that we use to tackle this problem. But particularly for older generator or older fossil generator that doesn't run frequently and doesn't participate in the energy market very frequently, for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's has environmental run restrictions and we only run it when we really need it, or maybe it's just an expensive generator. Whatever the reason that it doesn't run frequently, its only mechanism for recovering its costs to keep it staffed, to keep it the machine operational, is that capacity market. And so that's really the benefit of the capacity market, is to make sure that we have those units when we need them. But until they are here, you very much need the current fleet to be operational to meet our day-to-day energy needs.
Well put there. I think that's simple to understand. And we raised Texas earlier. I think point to California, because that's a good contrast with what you just said, where they, the last couple of years, have run into tight supply situations and had to roll out some of those older, dirtier, less efficient units that they had sought to retire. Looks now like they maybe have moved too fast and then came up against some reliability concerns. Is that a fair way to describe that contrast?
Yeah, it's a very difficult balancing act as you transition a fleet from one set of technologies to a newer set of technologies, particularly when you want to keep reliability, when you want to keep the lights on. It would be really easy if everybody used a constant amount of energy and things didn't change. But not only is our supply technology changing, right? We're moving from fossil-based resources to renewable and storage-based resources, but our demand for electricity, that's also radically changing. Electrification is a huge driver. People are converting from fossil-based heating and cooking systems to heat pumps or electricity-based heating and cooling systems. Our transportation sector is converting from gas and diesel-based transportation to electricity-based vehicles. And so our load is also changing. Our demand for energy is also changing. And so we have to very carefully make sure that we don't exit out the existing generators for reliability need, because that load profile is also changing and is also increasing as well. And so we need to make sure that balance is maintained to be able to meet all of our electricity needs as we transition both the supply and the demand side of the equation in the electricity world.
We always talk about that simple principle of balancing supply and demand. That's the story of the grid. Of course, we've got those large economic development projects that want to site in upstate New York. Making sure we have supply to facilitate those will be critically important going forward. Shaun, let's just spend the last couple minutes. You've been really gracious with your time on the process. It's an open, transparent process with lots of different stakeholders involved to comment, a lot of analysis and data for folks to pore over. What's the schedule, roughly speaking, going forward? The demand curve reset is intended to inform prices not until 2025, but where do we go from here? We're recording this at the end of June.
So right now, the process has already been underway for about a year. So very lengthy process. And as Kevin, as you pointed out, the intent for that is to make sure that there is abundant opportunity for dialogue and communication with a variety of stakeholders. And one of the first parts of that process is the NYISO engages with an independent consultant to come in and evaluate all the stuff that we talked about that goes into the demand curve and to make a series of recommendations. And they have posted their preliminary recommendations recently. The next step in the process that we are expecting any day here is that a variety of stakeholders who are engaged in this process, and this is government agencies, loads, generators, marketers, to submit comments on those initial recommendations from the consultant. Those will be reviewed, and eventually the NYISO staff makes a set of recommendations based off of the consultant's recommendations and feedback from stakeholders. We then go through another round of stakeholder comments and feedback on the NYISO's recommendations. Ultimately, a final recommendation is made by the NYISO and is submitted to the NYISO Board of Directors for their evaluation. That process includes another round of written and oral comments from any stakeholder group that wants to brief the board with their thoughts and interpretations of the demand curve process. And then ultimately, the board makes a final determination, and that gets filed with our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, who then gets another round of comments from the stakeholder community. And then FERC ultimately will decide on the reasonableness of what the NYISO filed and either approve or make a different determination or send it back to the NYISO for consideration. ultimately before the demand curve process is finalized to be used for next summer's capacity market. So we're still almost a year out from this process being in place and has been in process for a year already. So it is a very lengthy process with several rounds and opportunities for folks to be engaged and provide their thoughts and feedback.
Well, there's so much more to cover, but we're running out of time. So maybe we have you back. We get deeper into this. I think there'll be more analysis probably and questions that we might want to try and address later. And we can talk about capability periods and spot market auctions then too, if necessary. But you've been really, like I said, gracious with your time. We appreciate it. And thanks again, Shaun.
My pleasure, Kevin.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.